excited and I'm thrilled to be here tonight on the MC for Renee's launch of her second book, Unravelling Us. It's a very exciting time because this book has been a long time in the making. It took a lot of courage for Renee to find the words, to write them down and then to share them. But she was compelled to do something that would break the patterns of mothering scenarios that don't serve and to create something new and special and beautiful. We're so proud of you, Renee. Love you very much. Well done, you're a rock star.
Women dream of fiery feeling in the wind. I'm thinking about it. History's old, centuries old.
A couple of years ago, we were sitting on my front veranda drinking cups of tea, and Renee was in the middle of writing this story. She wanted to write this story with all her heart and soul and mind. She'd written a first draft, probably a second. She was writing whenever she could get a moment amongst her busy life with many children and a newborn. Evie, I think, was barely 12 months. And she was sitting there with despair in her eyes. And she said, I have this story. I want to tell this story. I've written it down. It's so important, but... And then she had 1,000 doubts. Should I write it? Will anybody want to read it? Will it be a problem? Will the publishers like it? She was plagued with self-doubt. Anyhow, it wasn't long after that that she told me she'd approached her publishers, the publishers who published House of Lies, Hachette. And she had a wonderful publisher there who really encouraged her to write this story. And Renee said to me, this story in some ways is far more difficult to write than House of Lies because it's so personal. And as I untangled the story from her, she told me it was of her and her mother. Now, all of you who have read House of Lies know of Renee's early years. Now, not many of us could have survived that kind of an upbringing, I suspect. But Renee not only did, she just became even warmer and a more beautiful human being as a result. And so she wrote this book from her heart, and it was about breaking the chains, breaking the patterns, breaking the stories of the past that hold us captive to the kind of life and the kind of thinking that doesn't serve us, that in fact pulls us apart and brings us down. And despite the challenges that Renee had in her own life, she was determined to break those patterns herself and then write about it. Now, not many people have the courage to do that. It's hard enough working on yourself in this lifetime and breaking the odd pattern, much less writing about it for everyone to hear and see. But that's what Renee did. And so eventually she said, here it is. What do you think? And so she gave me the manuscript to read, and she said, it's terrible, you're not going to like it, it's just... And I sat down and opened it and I read it in one sitting, a whole day. I lost an entire day and I cried for most of it. But they were tears of despair in some parts, but mostly tears of joy at Renee's beautiful prose and her courage. And I rang her the minute I finished the last page and I said, Renee, it is brilliant. And she said, but I think I have to rewrite this and that. And I said, Renee, it's cooked. And I remember so well saying to her, it is cooked. Yes, you might edit a bit of this and that, but it's done. It is brilliant. This story needs to come out. It's a story of hope and healing. And do we ever need hope and healing in this world? Renee has had the courage to write about that, and the joy and the champagne, may I add, we drank when she got the news that it was to be published. And Renee has just been on a rock star whirlwind week in Sydney where she's been feted by crowds. She's been interviewed on 1+1. She's been interviewed by Mia Friedman. She's a rock star, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give a big hand to Renee McBryde.
Thank you, Tanya. That was very over the top. Thank you.
Hi everyone, lovely to see everyone out tonight at Older Pink Botanic Garden. My name's Alex Barwick. I'm from ABC Local Radio here in Alice Springs. And I really remember so distinctly back in 2017 meeting Renee for a coffee for the very first time at Tallulah's because I was fortunate enough to interview her at the Northern Territory Writers' Festival. She just released her first memoir, The House of Lies. Since then, we've actually just become really great friends, which is lovely. And so it's just such a pleasure to have this conversation. To have this is this okay? Yeah. To have this conversation with you all here tonight. Unravelling Us, it is beautifully written. It is such an honest exploration of what motherhood looks like when tangled up with trauma and grief. So Renee, thank you so much for speaking about your story tonight in front of everyone. Okay, before we get to the really hard stuff, can you just share some of those early memories of growing up with your mum?
I guess as a child, I just thought my mum was so vivacious and fun, and she used to just blare the music and let me stay up late and, you know, talk till the wee hours with me, and I never had a bedtime, and it was fun, and she was just so vivacious and beautiful and always sort of the life of the party. And then maybe other times, maybe not so much, and she was really sad, but for always I was her person, and it was just me and her against the world.
And sometimes you talk about it felt like you were sisters, but with hindsight, there were red flags, weren't there? There were red flags that your mum was actually really struggling with motherhood. What were some of those?
Well, I think because she fell pregnant at 15, and she jumped straight from having this super traumatic experience with my father being arrested, and then was a mother. And so she never really had time to process all of those things that had gone on in her life. And so as a small child, I guess I was often with my grandparents on the weekends. Every weekend I was with my grandparents so that she could kind of go out and be a teenager and party. And then I guess also as she tried to come to terms with what had happened in her early life, she started to drink a lot and really find the only way that she could talk about what had happened was when she was drinking.
So your nan played a huge role in growing you up, but your nan also was carrying extraordinary grief and trauma as well, and that only became sort of revealed to you a bit later. What had happened to her?
Well, when my nan passed away, we found out that she was about 15 years older than what she had told us she was. And we were really trying to finalise all of her death. And I say this, I was 12 and we were trying to do all the paperwork together, me and my mum, because she didn't finish school. So she found that stuff really hard. So we were trying to figure out all that together, but we couldn't get a death certificate because no record of this woman was born in that year. And what she had done was just erase basically 15 years of her life, where she had previously been married and had 4 children and had tried to escape a terrible marriage, a violent marriage. And she had tried to escape initially with the children, and her mother at the time told her husband, and he caught them and took them all back. And so the next time she left without them, and they were left there in Tasmania. And she never saw them again. And we didn't find out that she had carried that to her grave. And she had cancer when she passed away, and her last words were, "I can't take the pain anymore." But when we found that out about all of those children she'd left behind, I was convinced that it was that pain that she was talking about.
So much of your growing up was carrying these secrets, and I know your mum, basically said to you, you can't tell people these things. That must have been a huge burden. But what did your mum say to you about why you just shouldn't tell anyone any of these things about your father and about your nan?
Well, she just believed that if anybody knew the truth, there was no possible way that they could accept us as people in the community, as friends. No one would love her or love me because it was just too great a shame of what had happened. And she really, really believed that to her core. So she didn't want anybody to ever know. And her expectation at the time was that I would grow up and, I guess, marry someone and still keep that a secret and never tell anyone, and that I would die like my grandmother had and people would just find out later.
And so what was that like, carrying that huge secret through primary years, through high school?
I think I just developed a real persona of like, oh, I can't slip up. So when I was younger, I tried to kind of experiment and say, like, with people like, where's your dad? I would be like, oh, yeah, he died, or, oh, that boyfriend is my dad, or, yeah, oh, he works at Cotty's. Or I just didn't know. Like, so I was kind of making stuff up as I went and seeing what might land with other people. And then I had, like, panicked about, oh, I hope they don't all check the stories together. Like, and then, I guess as I was growing up and making friendships, I sort of felt like, this can't be true, that, like, I can't ever say the truth. Like, that's a long time, like, to not be honest. Yeah.
Throughout Unravelling Us, you talk a lot about the fear of failure, the fear of kind of repeating cycles of the past. And as a young adult, you actually experienced quite a lot of traumas in your own life, including a really violent relationship. At that time, when you were experiencing really significant traumas as a young adult, where did you think your life was headed?
I think I was really deep in that relationship, and it was so rock bottom for me. And there was this one night where my mum was like really drunk and crying and just talking about like my dad's crimes, and I realized like, oh, this is like, I think at the time like 20 something years ago, and I just felt like, oh my gosh, this is not just her, this is going to be me when I'm 40. And like, if I don't make a choice, I can't just let all these things that have happened in this relationship, like, I'm still young, I've got time, I can turn it around kind of thing. And it was looking at her and realising like, well, I can let this define me, or I can turn it around now and make a choice. And yeah, I think it was that image of her and how she'd just been so consumed by this trauma of the past that didn't define her, but she felt that it did, that I felt like I was presented with this choice of change it or keep going this way.
So if we then fast forward a little bit, you do find a really loving and stable relationship. That's John, that's Dad up to back.
He's all right. John. Yeah.
And together you begin a family. And you've got a relationship with your mum. It's pretty up and down. It's a bit of a roller coaster, really. And then things become really difficult and fractured, and you have to make some really tough decisions, which really put your own kids first. What was it like when that sort of started to come apart?
I think my mum's mental health had always been so up and down, and was so much a part of mine and John's life too when he joined the party, because it was my job to be there for her always. And that was kind of like the purpose of why she had me when she was so young, is because she was like, I've never had this love and I want to keep this baby, and she will love me and she'll make everything good, which is kind of beautiful in one way, but also an enormous pressure. And so I think over time, particularly once I became a mother, I realised like, oh, I can't actually give you my best all the time anymore, Mum, because I have to give it to my child and my relationship. And that kind of broke this relationship that we had been bound in for our whole lives, because she couldn't be, I couldn't be everything to her anymore. And so I think I struggled with that, and she certainly struggled with that, because I felt like as things got worse and she was in and out of my life, that was normal. But when it was missing from my children's life, and where is she, and oh, she's in another dark place, it became harder to explain, and I realised I didn't want that inconsistency for them and that pressure for them.
Unravelling Us really makes the reader think a lot about your own mother-child relationships. You pose lots of questions through it, which are just really great. One of them is you ask the question, all mothers are bound to their children, aren't they? But your conclusion in the book is actually no. But how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, I think I came to the conclusion that all children are bound to their mothers instead. I think in a healthy, strong relationship, where people have the ability to be born into or the privilege to be born into a family where everything's kind of good, then yes, that's normal that the mother is bound to their child and will do anything. But often when there's trauma, or the mother is traumatized and hasn't maybe had a chance or an opportunity to resolve those things, then the child then almost is parenting their parent. And I guess that became really apparent to me through the work that I do as a social worker. And kids just never give up on their parent. And I saw that possibly through my work. It became apparent that that was me as well.
Yeah, you weave through Unravelling Us quite a few really personal stories. They're completely de-identified, but they are stories, real stories of mothers and children who have come into the Northern Territory's child protection system. And you weave that through your own personal story of trauma and grief. And I wondered why you decided to do that.
One of the reasons I wrote the book was a boy who, for every intent and purposes, could see that he shouldn't be with his mother, but that's all he wanted. And he reminded me of me, and his mother reminded me of my mother. And I just think, we think that we're so far away from everybody else, but actually it's a cycle, and it doesn't matter if we're white, black, young, old, teenager, toddler. We all want the love of our parent.
The stories are pretty devastating that are included in the book, and you do give a fair bit of context, which I think is going to be really helpful for readers, but you don't try and provide any sort of tidy explanation or solution. But I wonder what you do hope readers will take away from including those stories.
I think what I hope that people will take away is that if they've had that sort of traumatic relationship themselves, that it is possible to change if you even have the privilege to know that you're part of a cycle. And some kids won't. And I'm lucky that I have had that space through education or, just opportunity to step aside. And certainly my mother did try to give me all of those resources. And while she may not have reached it herself, I think she was able to provide me a platform in some ways to do so. And I guess I thought these other kids' stories were important to show just how common it is that we have to try and reparent ourselves. And if kids don't know that that's what is happening for them in their life because it's normal, then they can't be expected to be any different. And we shouldn't have those expectations on people. And I guess I hope that we maybe down the track will focus more on healing the trauma of the mothers instead of just placing this expectation on these children that they'll be able to do better when they don't have the tools in their toolkit yet. And maybe that's what we should focus on giving them.
And then there's the fathers, which are generally absent in a lot of the stories that you've shared, and certainly absent in your own story. I mean, what sort of pressure does that place on a lot of these mothers who are walking with so much trauma and grief?
Well, I think that's what I realised through my work, but also my own story, is that this, for me, my dad was in prison. A lot of the kids that I work with, their dads are in prison. And so there's this real pressure on the mothers, you must do this, you must be a good mother, you must get this right. And that's not just in a trauma cycle, that's just in every day. Like, you know, if my husband takes the kids all to the supermarket, people are stopping him being like, you're amazing, giving your wife a break. But if I'm there and they like slightly do something wrong, there's like, you don't have that under control. You know, like there's just a different expectation on mothers and fathers. And I think that's shifting. But when there's a trauma in play and dad's in prison and, you know, mum's got this weight of, like, my mother had one child, but mothers here often that I'm working with have 4, 5, 6, you know, and where is her space to think, like, am I in a trauma cycle? Or what's his crimes that have landed him in prison? How has that affected me and my mothering and my kids, and how can I heal that? You know, there's no space, there's no time for thinking, because in my set, the child protection are breathing down your neck, and there's food to put on the table, and there's lots of things going on and complications and barriers to how that trauma can be healed. And so, yeah, I think it's important to think about those things too.
I want to come back to the relationship you have with you had with your mum. You write really honestly about what are pretty incredibly cruel things that your mum says to you over the years, from pretending that you didn't exist, to saying that she regretted having you, to threatening suicide regularly, while also, and you do see this thread through, while also loving you. Despite all of this, it's really clear that you do love your mum so much. And I guess I did wonder how you've reconciled and kind of made peace with the hurt that came from all of that.
Well, I think, I think she loved me the best way that she knew how. And when, you know, she in many ways was never able to resolve those traumas of hers, and so I feel compassion for that, and I feel like you know, maybe if she had a great social worker like me, or like a great mental health worker or something like that, then her life could have been different, and I can accept that. And know that she didn't have the space to do those things. And when she was up, she was up. She was the life of the party, and she was beautiful and funny, and to make her laugh was like one of the greatest joys that you could have, because, you know, it was hard won, I guess. So, yeah, and, you know, I think, like, sometimes we forgive people for things because we need to as well.
Throughout the first part of the book, you talk about how you're sort of gathering a bit of a blueprint for motherhood, which I think lots of people do before they have kids. I just wondered how, now being a mother of 4 and working with so many other mums, how that's kind of shifted and changed whatever blueprint you'd put together in the early years.
Well, it's really funny that I put this whole blueprint together, because my husband would say I'm hopeless with a map. So it was like I kind of put this blueprint together being like, yes, this will guide me. But like that went out the window really, because it was like, oh, this is different. Like, I don't know. I guess that's not true. I guess I kind of have always put together bits of women that I've admired. I've collected like lots of stand-in mums who I've been like, oh, I wish that could have been my mum, or I love that about that woman. And I guess I'd always hoped that I would just borrow all of those things and, you know, put a patchwork together. And I think that those are all things that I still have tried to apply in my mothering, but then I've also just realised, like, probably for every child, like, their mother kind of knows what to do and has that great instinct, usually, you know. So my blueprint was, like, felt like safe for me and made me feel like, okay, I got a plan going in. But it's like, I guess, travelling to a country with a guidebook and you realise halfway through, like, I don't know, just work it out as I go. Yeah.
There's a line that I absolutely love that reads like this. It's towards the end of the book. It says, "We can love outside the footprints of the past." And I guess what you've shown in your own life, with your kids, with John, is that you've broken the cycle in your own family and through the generations. And I think a lot of people talk about you being really resilient and maybe want to know how you've done that.
I think I was trying to, when I wrote this book, think about, like, for the kids that I work with or me, like, how can we break this cycle? How can all of us do it? Like, what's the sort of blueprint? It's a diagram that I could put together and then be like, this is how we're going to do it, guys. But what I realised, I think, is it's actually just that space of knowing, like, oh, I'm in a cycle and I have to be really intentional about making sure I don't follow that. And that that if I hear, like, my mum's voice sneaking out, I could stop it and I could just be different if I focus on it. And having that space to do that, I think it's about intentional change, and otherwise it's just not possible because you're just too swept up in it.
We're actually going to leave it there, Renee. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about your story, about your book, Unravelling Us. Please join me in thanking Renee McBryde for sharing her story this evening.
Thank you.
Women dream a fiery feeling in the wind. I'm thinking about it. History's old, centuries old. We're wearing black stars standing back. Send it down.
Hello, dear Rebecca.